No mail-order bride lasted 1 week with the mountain man, until the fat one refused to leave. "Don't bother unpacking your trunk, miss," one man sneered as Bethany Dawson stepped off the stagecoach in Silver Bluff. "No bride lasts a week with Robert Rohr. Best save yourself the trouble." The crowd erupted in laughter, their eyes darting to her round figure, her travel-worn dress stretched across her stout frame. Someone whispered, "This one's even fatter than the last. She won't last 3 days." The jeers stung, but Bethany held her head high. She had lived 42 years hearing such mockery. She had not crossed mountains and rivers to crumble at their cruelty. From the edge of the street he appeared, Robert Rohr, the mountain man of whispered legend. Taller than any in the crowd, shoulders broad as a barn door, face lined by years of solitude, he stood like granite against the laughter. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He only looked at Bethany with eyes as unreadable as stone. "Your trunk?" he asked gruffly. Bethany placed her gloved hand on the battered case. "I carry it myself." The townsfolk smirked, expecting her to falter, but she lifted the trunk, heavy with linens and faith, and marched beside the mountain man toward the waiting wagon. Behind them, the laughter followed like a swarm of flies. That night, when they reached his remote cabin, a place more ruin than home, Robert paused at the threshold. His voice was low, rough with years of bitterness. "No one stays. I'll give you the chance to turn back now." Bethany met his gaze, her breath steady, her spirit unshaken. "I didn't come to leave, Mr. Rohr. I came to stay." And with those words, the first crack appeared in the wall of stone he had built around his heart. Bethany Dawson had never been anyone's first choice. Not as a child in her father's crowded farmhouse, where her thinner sisters were courted while she remained at the spinning wheel, not as a woman in town, where whispers followed her wide figure and soft cheeks. And certainly not now, when she stepped off the stagecoach as a mail-order bride, carrying not beauty nor youth, but resilience forged by years of hard living. She was stout, with broad shoulders and arms that had kneaded bread, hoisted water, and cradled orphan children left at her church. Her face was plain, her hair streaked with silver, but in her eyes burned a quiet fire of faith, of determination, of a woman too stubborn to break. Robert Rohr was the opposite image. He was tall, rugged, a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very mountains that loomed over Silver Bluff. His beard was thick, streaked with gray, his hands calloused by axe and rifle. Silence clung to him like a second skin. For nearly a decade, he had lived half wild in the high timber, only descending to town for supplies. Whispers called him a recluse, a widower, haunted by loss, a man cursed because every bride who came to him left before the week was out. The truth was uglier than rumor. Each woman who had stepped into Robert's life had been driven away, not by his temper, but by fear planted by Gideon Pike, the town's sly land agent. Pike had much to gain if Robert were alone. A solitary man was easier to break than a married couple. He had told each bride lies, that Robert had killed his first wife, that he was dangerous, unstable. Combined with the isolation of the cabin and Robert's own stiff, gruff manner, the women had fled one after another, leaving him hardened, resigned to solitude. So when Bethany arrived, the townspeople expected another humiliation. At the general store, whispers followed her as she bought flour and salt. "She's too old, too fat, too soft," one woman scoffed. "He'll scare her off before Sunday." The Blackwood brothers, Pike's lackeys, jeered openly. "Better get 2 mules, Roar, one for her and one for the trunk." Laughter rolled through the room. Bethany heard every word. Her cheeks flushed, but she did not lower her eyes. Instead, she squared her shoulders and said, calm and firm, "A mule that carries its load without complaint is worth more than a horse that runs but cannot endure." The room fell into a stunned silence. Robert, who had watched in silence, felt something shift within him. He had expected her to cower, to cry, to bolt. Instead, she stood her ground. That night, when they reached his cabin, Bethany was not dismayed by its state. The roof sagged, the hearth was cold, dust lay thick on every surface. Where another woman might have despaired, she simply rolled up her sleeves. She swept, scrubbed, and lit a fire, her voice humming an old hymn that filled the cabin with warmth Robert had not felt in years. When he muttered, "You don't have to stay," she turned from the hearth, her face glowing in firelight. "I came to stay," she said again. And for the first time in years, Robert Rohr felt the stirrings of something he thought he had buried forever. Hope. The trail from Silver Bluff to Robert's cabin was unforgiving. It wound through steep switchbacks, over frozen creeks, and into the shadow of towering pines. Snow lingered in patches along the ridges, though spring had touched the valley below. The climb was long and lonely, the kind of road that could break a newcomer's spirit before the cabin even came into view. Robert, mounted on his sturdy sorrel horse, kept his eyes forward, speaking little. He had learned long ago not to waste words. Beside him, Bethany plodded with determined steps, her skirts catching brambles, her boots sinking into mud. She carried herself with dignity, even as she stumbled on loose rocks. Robert glanced at her more than once, half expecting her to falter, to demand to turn back like the others. But each time she stumbled, she steadied herself with surprising strength. She never complained, never asked for help. When they stopped to rest, she only brushed dirt from her dress and said, "The Lord gave me legs to walk, and I'll use them." At dusk, Robert tested her resolve. He halted near a small clearing by the creek and said, "We'll camp here. You'll need to haul water, chop kindling, and set the fire." He handed her the axe without another word. Bethany accepted the heavy tool, its worn handle dwarfed in her hands, yet she carried it to the woodpile. The first swing was clumsy, jarring her arms, but she set her jaw and struck again. Sparks of effort lit her cheeks red. By the 10th strike, a log split clean. Robert, watching from the shadows, raised his brows. She built the fire with practiced hands, coaxing flame from a tinder, then drew water from the creek. When he offered to help, she shook her head. "You asked me to do it. I'll see it done." That night, as stew bubbled in the iron pot, Robert listened to her hum the same hymn she had sung in the cabin. The low, steady tune wrapped around the clearing like a prayer. For the first time in years, he felt the silence of the mountains soften. But Robert was not ready to trust. The next morning, he tested her again. He gave her buckets and pointed up a steep ridge. "The spring's there. 2 trips should fill the barrels. If you're staying, you'll need to manage it." The climb was cruel, the path slick with moss. Robert followed at a distance, expecting her to quit. Yet Bethany braced herself, carried 1 bucket at a time, and descended with steady steps. By the second trip, sweat dampened her brow, her breath came in gasps, but she did not stop until both barrels brimmed. When she returned, she met his gaze squarely. "There, now your water's ready. What next? For a moment, Robert had no answer. He had expected defiance or surrender, not calm determination. Over the next days, the pattern repeated. He showed her how to mend a broken fence, expecting her to curse the splinters. She completed the task, humming softly. He pointed her toward the smokehouse to scrub years of grime. She emerged covered in soot, but smiling faintly, saying, "It'll do better work now." Each test he set was meant to prove she didn't belong. Instead, they revealed her endurance, her quiet dignity. The cabin grew warmer, cleaner, more alive under her touch. Meals returned to the table. The fire never died out at night. One evening, when he came in from chopping wood, he found her at the table mending a quilt she had found in his trunk. His mother's quilt, the only piece of his past he cherished. She had washed it, stitched it with care, and laid it across the bed. Robert stopped in the doorway, struck speechless. Bethany looked up and said gently, "A man ought to rest under something that reminds him of where he came from." For the first time in years, Robert Rohr smiled, a small, fleeting thing, but real. He had brought her here expecting another week of disappointment. Instead, she had turned his tests into proof of her place. For the first time, he began to believe she might truly stay. Robert's cabin was more fortress than home when Bethany first crossed its threshold. The shutters hung crooked, the floor was packed dirt in places, and the hearth was choked with ashes. Dust coated every beam, and the air smelled of damp leather and old smoke. It was the dwelling of a man who expected no one to stay, who lived only to endure. Bethany saw not ruin, but possibility. She set about her work with quiet determination. While Robert split logs, she scrubbed the hearth until flame leapt warmly against stone. She swept the floor, humming her hymns until the dirt no longer clung to her skirts. She aired quilts, patched leaks in the roof with strips of cloth dipped in pitch, and placed sprigs of pine near the windows to freshen the stale air. Slowly, the cabin changed. It became brighter, warmer, touched with the essence of care. Robert noticed, though he said little. He watched her movements, the way she bent to tuck kindling, the way her hands smoothed the quilt she mended, the way she quietly left him the largest portion of stew and took the smaller share for herself. She was not a guest waiting to leave, nor a woman angling for pity. She was making a home. Meals became the first bridge between them. Robert, used to eating charred venison alone, found steaming cornbread waiting at his table, beans seasoned with a pinch of herbs, coffee brewed strong and hot. Bethany served him with no fanfare, then sat opposite him and bowed her head in prayer. One evening, after a particularly long silence, he muttered, "You cook like my mother did." Bethany's eyes softened. "Then she taught you to expect food made with care." He did not reply, but that night he left her the last piece of cornbread. The days fell into rhythm. Robert rose before dawn to hunt or fell trees. Bethany tended the cabin, baked bread, and learned to carry water without spilling a drop. Yet she also followed him into the forest, insisting on learning what kept them alive. He tried to dissuade her. "The woods aren't gentle," but she only smiled. "Neither am I, Mr. Rohr." She stumbled often at first, her skirt snagging on brambles, but she persisted. He showed her where trout lingered beneath icy pools. She showed him how to sew a torn shirt sleeve. He taught her to stack wood so it dried evenly. She taught him to read scripture aloud again, their voices mingling over candlelight. Small gestures became threads weaving something larger. One evening, she dozed by the hearth, her mended quilt draped over her shoulders. Robert, entering from the cold, paused to pull another blanket across her, his hand lingering a second longer than necessary. Another morning, when he returned from a hunt with a rabbit, she pressed a steaming mug of coffee into his hands before he could remove his coat. Their eyes met, words unspoken but heavy with meaning. Bethany's laughter, low, unguarded, full, began to fill the cabin. Robert had not heard laughter within those walls since boyhood. At first, it unsettled him, like a bird suddenly nesting in a silent canyon. But soon he realized he was waiting for it, yearning for it. The townsfolk's voices still echoed in her memory, fat, unwanted, foolish. Yet here, in the wilderness, those voices grew faint. Each time she swung the axe, each time she climbed the ridge with full buckets, each time Robert watched her with that unreadable gaze that was slowly softening, she felt her worth taking root. One evening, as snow whispered against the roof, she placed a loaf of fresh bread on the table. Robert broke it in half, handed her the larger piece, and said gruffly, "Eat first. You've earned it." Bethany's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken those words to her, not as a woman, not as a wife. And in that simple act, she saw the truth. Robert Rohr, the man who had expected her to leave, was beginning to need her. The cabin, once a lonely refuge, was becoming their shared home. And within its walls, something fragile yet unbreakable was stirring. Trust, respect, perhaps even the beginning of love. The thaw of spring came slowly to Silver Bluff. Snow melted from the ridges, the creek swelled with rushing water, and wildflowers pushed through soil that had been frozen for months. Inside the cabin, life was warmer than Robert had ever imagined possible. But peace in the mountains was never meant to last. It began with a discovery. Bethany was clearing the loft one afternoon when she found a trunk wedged beneath a sagging beam. The iron latch was rusted, but with steady hands she pried it open. Inside lay bundles of letters, yellowed with time, each bearing the names of women who had come before her, brides meant for Robert. Her breath caught as she read. One letter spoke of fear, that Robert had been accused of killing his first wife. Another claimed he was a thief who would soon be arrested. Others warned that his land had no legal standing, that staying with him would bring ruin. Each letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged as if written in haste, before the women disappeared from his life. Bethany's hands trembled, but not from fear of Robert. These letters had the same handwriting, smooth, slanted, deliberate. A name appeared more than once, Gideon Pike, the land agent. The truth settled like a stone in her stomach. The women had not fled Robert out of terror. They had been driven away by Pike's lies, whispered and written until fear consumed them. That evening, she laid the letters on the table. Robert returned from chopping wood, his face darkening as his eyes fell upon them. "Where did you get these?" His voice was sharp, defensive. "In the loft," she answered quietly. "Robert, these women didn't leave because of you. Someone wanted you alone." He picked up one letter, crumpled it in his fist, then dropped it into the fire. The flames devoured the page with a hiss. His jaw tightened, eyes clouded with old pain. "I told myself it was my fault. Easier that way. Pike." His voice broke, then hardened. "He's been after my land for years. Now I see how far he went." Bethany reached across the table, laying her hand over his. "Then we fight. Together." Robert searched her face, the firelight catching the steel in her eyes. For the first time, he saw not just a woman who had endured his tests, but a partner who would not run. The very next day, the fight came to them. They rode into town for supplies, only to find Pike waiting outside the mercantile, a smirk on his well-groomed face, his voice carried so all the townsfolk could hear. "Ah, the new bride who thinks she'll last," Pike drawled. "Careful, madam, Roar's temper is known to kill. Best pack your things before you're buried under these mountains." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Bethany's cheeks burned, but she stood tall. "If lies were gold, Mr. Pike, you'd be the richest man in the territory." The crowd gasped. Robert's eyes narrowed, his hand flexing near the rifle slung across his back. Pike only smiled thinly. "Enjoy your little victory, Roar. But when the railroad comes through, your land will be mine, lawfully." Robert nearly lunged at him, then, rage boiling, but Bethany touched his arm. Her steady voice cut through the fury. Not like this, not his way. That night, Bethany prayed long after Robert had fallen into restless sleep. She knew Pike's schemes reached further than forged letters. If the railroad stood behind him, they faced not just lies, but a machine powerful enough to crush mountains. The next Sunday, she found her first ally. After the service, Bethany spoke quietly with Pastor Whitlow, the gray-haired minister who had lived in Silver Bluff since its founding. She showed him one of the forged letters she had saved, his brow furrowed deeply. "Pike's hand, sure as the devil's mark," he muttered. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "I've seen the original survey maps. Robert's claim is older, stronger than Pike admits. Those records still exist, locked away in the church's strongbox." Hope stirred in Bethany's chest, but so did fear. Pike would not yield easily. If he had manipulated half a dozen women into running, if he had poisoned the town against Robert, what would he do when his lies were exposed? The answer came sooner than she expected. That night, shadows moved outside the cabin. Dogs barked. Then a sudden whoosh of fire split the darkness. Flames licked the walls as men's laughter echoed in the trees. Pike's men had come, and they meant to burn Robert and Bethany out for good. Bethany seized a pail of water and dashed it against the flames, her burned arm screaming in protest. Robert roared into the night with his rifle, sending the attackers fleeing into the woods. When the fire was beaten back, half the cabin lay blackened, smoke curling toward the stars. Robert dropped to his knees, head in his hands. "He won't stop, Bethany. He'll drive us into the ground." She knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders with surprising strength. "Then we don't run. We prove the truth. Pike thrives on lies and fear. We'll strip him of both." And for the first time, Robert believed it could be done. The smell of charred timber lingered in Robert's cabin for days. Each blackened beam was a reminder of how close Pike had come to driving them out. Robert's anger smoldered hotter than the fire had, and one night he strapped on his rifle with murder in his eyes. "I'll end this tonight," he growled, shoulders taut as steel. "Pike won't lay hands on our land again." Bethany stepped into his path, her burned arm still bandaged, her eyes blazing with a strength that startled him. "If you kill him, Robert, then every lie he's ever told about you becomes truth. You'll be the monster he painted you to be. That's what he wants." His chest heaved, silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the weakened hearth. Then his shoulders sagged. He let the rifle fall against the wall. "Then how do we fight?" "With truth," she answered simply. "With law, with faith." 2 days later, their chance came. A territorial judge visited Silver Bluff to hear disputes, and Pike had arranged a Sunday service to parade his influence. The church was full to bursting, townsfolk whispering, railroad men smirking, Pike standing tall in the front pew like he owned the place. When the service ended, Robert rose, his towering figure casting a long shadow down the aisle. He strode to the pulpit, Bethany at his side, and laid a bundle of worn papers on the lectern. "These are the original survey maps," Robert declared, his voice deep and steady, "filed before Pike ever set foot in Silver Bluff. They prove this land is mine by right." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Pike scoffed loudly. "Forgeries! Lies from a murderer and his fat wife." Bethany stepped forward then, her voice ringing clearer than any bell. "I found his letters, dozens of them. He forged lies to drive every woman away so Robert would stand alone. He even tried to burn us out, but the Lord spared us." She turned to the congregation, her bandaged arm trembling, but her eyes unwavering. "I will not run. I will not be silenced. This land belongs to my husband, and no amount of slander or fire will change that." A murmur of shame rippled through the church. The pastor rose from his pew, holding up a sealed record book. "I saw Pike alter the deeds. The truth is here. He has deceived us all." The judge, stern and watchful, examined the maps, the letters, the record book. Then he faced the congregation. "These are no forgeries. The law recognizes Robert Rohr's claim, and it will recognize his wife's courage as well. As for Gideon Pike, he'll answer for fraud, arson, and perjury." Pike's face drained of color. His protests fell on deaf ears as the sheriff's men closed in. For once, the jeering crowd was silent, their eyes turning not with mockery, but with awe, toward Bethany. Robert looked at her then, his voice rough with unspoken feeling. "You saved me. You saved us both." Bethany's lips trembled into a smile. "No, Robert, we saved each other." And in that moment, before judge and town alike, the mountain man and the bride no one thought would stay stood unbroken, vindicated, united, and stronger than ever. The cabin rose again, log by log, with neighbors lending their axes and strong backs. Where once there had been whispers and ridicule, now there was the sound of hammers, saws, and laughter. Bethany worked alongside them, her hands raw from hauling stones for the chimney, her dress smudged with soot. Yet her smile was brighter than the morning sun. When the last beam was set, the community gathered in front of the cabin. The pastor, who had once bowed to Pike's pressure, now stood humbled before Robert and Bethany. "A house rebuilt deserves a home blessed," he said gently, "and a marriage born in fire deserves vows spoken freely." Robert turned to Bethany, his massive, scarred hands cradling hers. "I never asked you proper, Bethany," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "But if you'll have me, not because you swore you'd stay, not because we fought Pike together, but because you might truly want me, I'll spend my life proving myself worthy of you." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes. "Robert, I came here with nothing but faith. Now I have a home, a partner, and a love I never dreamed I'd find. Yes, 1,000 times yes." The congregation erupted in cheers, children tossing pine cones like rice. The vows were simple, spoken with hearts laid bare, and sealed not by rings, but by the clasp of work-roughened hands that had already built a life together. That evening, as firelight glowed through the cabin's new windows, Robert whispered, "You're safe here. This is your home now if you'll have it." Bethany leaned against him, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. For the first time in years, she felt not mocked, not measured, but chosen, and though the mountains loomed high and wild around them, she knew their greatest test and greatest love had only just begun. Stories like Bethany and Robert's remind us that strength isn't always measured by muscle, and love isn't bound by appearances. It's about courage, faith, and refusing to give up when the world tells you to walk away. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances and hearts. Where are you listening from today? Share below. I'd love to know. And if you still believe in love that can withstand fire and rebuild a home, don't leave just yet. The next story is waiting for you.